Hey everybody. Today we're going to start with the first part of vitamin D. So vitamin D, it's a lot, it's probably one of the most popular vitamins as well. So we're going to basically split it up into two lectures. The first one we're going to go over the basic structure and functions, and then in the second lecture we're going to go over kind of like all the reasons why people supplement with vitamin D, whether it's useful in kind of preventing diseases and that type of thing, and kind of go over some of the science in that area. But just to give you a basic background, vitamin D was discovered again, similar to everything else, through a deficiency disorder. So, with vitamin D, the key thing that's noted is rickets in children. And just to explain a bit if you're not super familiar with rickets, basically what happens is the main characteristic is this bowing of the legs, and that occurs while the child is growing. And if they're not getting enough vitamin D, basically their bones can't mineralize properly, so they can't solidify properly. So the weight of the body literally just presses down on these long bones, and they kind of, since they're kind of rubbery, they kind of like bend out to the side. And it was noted that kids that had sufficient amounts of sun exposure, and if they had access to animal products, like if their families could like afford meat, that they were much less likely to develop rickets. So then they realized, oh, well, there's probably something in the animal products, in the meat, that's helping them prevent this disorder. And so they basically isolated vitamin D from meat. Yeah, and this is what it looks like. Vitamin D is also called cholecalciferol. There's lots of different forms of vitamin D, and it is a little bit confusing, but I do have a summary slide for it. So we'll go over the metabolism and all the different sources, etc. And vitamin D, I can't remember the exact date, but it was sometime in the early 1900s when it was isolated. Excuse me. So there's three main sources of vitamin D. The first source is the sun. And just to clarify, you probably already know this, we don't have vitamin D like floating down from the sun in the air or anything like that. Excuse me. So basically, what's happening is the sun helps us convert like a precursor form of vitamin D that our skin secretes, very basically. So basically, what's happening is that our skin is secreting something called 7-dehydrocholesterol. So that's mentioned right here, and this is what it looks like. So it looks pretty similar to vitamin D. It's basically synthesized and secreted by our sebaceous glands, and we basically secrete it all over on every part of our body. So it's uniformly distributed throughout the epidermis and the dermis. And yeah, it's basically just something that's secreted onto the skin surface, and it's kind of just hanging out there waiting to interact with the sun. And 7-dehydrocholesterol is special in that it has this conjugated set of double bonds here, and that allows the absorption of specific wavelengths of UV light. So that's kind of what the sun is hitting here. So again, this is secreted, hanging out on the skin. The sun hits this part. When that happens, this part absorbs photons, and then this ring structure opens up. And when this thing kind of opens up like this, it becomes pre-vitamin D3, or it's also called precalciferol. So importantly, this is 7-dehydrocholesterol. This is the one that's secreted onto the skin surface. It's waiting. Once it kind of gets touched by the sun, I guess you could see it like that, the sun causes this conformational change where the ring structure opens up. The second this breaks open, that's when it's called pre-vitamin D3 or precalciferol. Then that pre-vitamin D3 kind of hangs out on the skin for about, literally on the surface of the skin for about 2 to 3 days. And it stays there because it takes 2 to 3 days for it to undergo this conformational change. So from the last slide, this is that ring structure that opened up to make it pre-vitamin D3. It takes 2 or 3 days for basically this ring structure to open up, kind of crack open even more. And kind of like literally this part just kind of drops down. Basically, that's what's happening. And once it turns into this structure, it's called vitamin D3. That's kind of what we see as vitamin D. So it's actually called vitamin D3. It's also called cholecalciferol. And this is the form, vitamin D3. That's the form that once it finally kind of gets into that formation, that's the form that will actually get kind of sucked in, or like it will enter the bloodstream. It will enter the skin and go into the blood. So yeah, vitamin D3 diffuses from the skin into the blood. It's transported bound to DBP, or vitamin D binding protein. So again, all of that reaction that we just looked at happened on the surface of the skin. 7-dehydrocholesterol to pre-vitamin D3 turns into vitamin D3. Once it's finally in this form, that's when it can enter the blood and travel around to the rest of the body. So that's the first source. That's the sun. That's kind of how we get vitamin D from the sun. The second source is animal products. So we kind of mentioned this in the intro slides, but vitamin D is generally provided by foods of animal origin. And when you get it from meats and that type of thing, you generally get it as vitamin D3. So D3 is what you're getting as a food source. So it's already basically that thing that our body made after that conformational change. So that's something that you're just getting already in that form from foods. And then the third source is plant products, but this is very rare, I have to say. So basically the only thing that we actually get, the only plant that will provide vitamin D just naturally is mushrooms. But mushrooms actually have to be irradiated to actually give us vitamin D. So irradiation of mushrooms means that instead of like, it's basically a way of sterilizing mushrooms, because obviously they're covered in manure and stuff like that. So a lot of times with industrial farming, they will irradiate the mushrooms. They put some type of UV light on it to basically kill bacteria and that type of thing. And then at the same time, it will form. So this is the type of pre-vitamin D3 found in plant products. It's called pre-vitamin D2. It's also called ergosterol. And then once that light is applied to make the mushroom safe, basically, then it turns into ergocalciferol, which is also called vitamin D2. And the only thing that really differentiates this from D3, so the animal product one is D3, is that D2 has an extra double bond here. So it just has this one little structural difference. We're not going to talk a lot about vitamin D2 because whether or not it can actually do all the functions of vitamin D3, like the main type of vitamin D, isn't very clear. So I'll mention it here and there, but the main thing I want you to know about vitamin D2 is that you can get it from plants, but pretty much the only place you can get it from is mushrooms, and it's only when you irradiate the mushrooms you can get it into like the proper form. But just know plants aren't a very good source of vitamin D. So yeah, just to do a bit of a review here, the three major sources: skin. So what we're looking at there was, remember, 7-dehydrocholesterol secreted onto the surface, hangs out there, waits for the sun to touch it. Once the sun interacts with 7-dehydrocholesterol, turns into pre-vitamin D3. That then hangs out on the surface and undergoes a conformational change, which takes about 2 to 3 days. And then once it undergoes that full change, it's then vitamin D3. This is the form that kind of seeps into the skin and travels through the blood. That's the form that our body uses. Animal products just give us straight up D3. Plant products, specifically irradiated mushrooms only, is pretty much the only source that we know of yet, provide pre-D2, also called ergosterol. Once that irradiating light touches the ergosterol, it becomes vitamin D2. And we're still not sure if our body can actually use D2 like it uses D3, but it's kind of worth mentioning because there are some studies that show it can, but there's several studies that show that we don't really use D2. So, food sources of vitamin D. Again, not surprising, pretty much all animal products. So, really, things that have really high sources are like fish oil, liver, and fish. The RDAs for vitamin D are 15 micrograms for both men and women. So, if you want to write that somewhere on your slide, 15 micrograms, yep, for both sexes. And then I just want to point out too, even though I'm saying animal products have really high amounts of vitamin D, dairy products generally only are a really good source of this when they're fortified. So if you look at milk, we're always like, oh, you get your D from milk, but actually you only get it because it's fortified. Milk generally doesn't have much vitamin D in it unless it's kind of like added during the whole like production process of milk. Um, Irradiated mushrooms have, 1 microgram, so a little bit. Again, it's in the D2 form. But if you look at like fish oil, just 1 tablespoon of fish oil provides like basically like 3 times the amount of vitamin D you need for the day. So a very good source. But yeah, most things provide just kind of small amounts of vitamin D. I'd say the other major place where we get it is really, or probably where most Americans are consuming vitamin D, is really through fortified and enriched, more like processed foods. So, yeah, we're looking at mainly like dairy products and grain products here. And then when they add vitamin D in the US to these fortified and enriched products, they're actually adding vitamin D3. So it's not D2 that's added. In Europe, I hear that some countries will add D2 instead, which I find kind of interesting considering that we don't know if it's biologically available or as biologically available as D3. But yeah, if you kind of skim or look at what we have here, we're actually getting slightly higher amounts. So if you look at all the animal products, most of them are just providing 1 microgram per day. But then if you look at all these kind of fortified and enriched dairy and grain products, we're getting more like, like 3 micrograms per day or 2 to 3 basically. So yeah, you find it in like cheese, yogurt, a lot of the milks, like soy milk and almond milk and oat milk and all the different milks now provide, from what I've seen, 2 to 3 micrograms per serving, which is usually a cup. And then, of course, now you can get it in like orange juice. And basically 10 years ago, vitamin D was like extremely popular. It's funny because when I took this class 20 years ago, our vitamin D lecture was like 10 minutes. Nobody really cared about it. We just talked about calcium homeostasis and that was it as a function, which obviously it's still involved in now. But in general, yeah, there wasn't much attention paid to it. And now it's become really popular and basically people just keep on, noticing that people that have low vitamin D status are at risk for several different diseases, which we'll talk about, in the next lecture. So vitamin D supplements are available without a prescription, even though sometimes really high, if you need the really high amounts, some people will get like these massive injections. Those you need prescriptions for. But most of the time, you're getting kind of smaller quantities of vitamin D. And for the most part, it's like 5 to 20 micrograms, and they're usually given in these like kind of gel cap forms. So most of the fat soluble vitamins that I've seen, sometimes you'll see tablets, but since they are fat soluble, they usually put them in some type of oil. Sometimes they're also just given as like pure fish oil, but for those of you that have tried to take those, they're a little tricky because fish oil gives you like fish burps, which is like this kind of like gross. Well, I guess you could figure it out just by what I'm saying. But a lot of people don't like supplementing with straight up fish oil because, yeah, you get this kind of fishy aftertaste in your mouth for a long time. And then another thing to point out is a lot of the times you'll actually see calcium and vitamin D provided in the same supplement. And that's because one of the main things that it's used for, obviously, is the treatment and prevention of osteoporosis. So we'll talk about that as well and how much you need to both treat and prevent osteoporosis. I haven't seen vitamin D2 Like when you look at supplements, it's pretty much always D3. Some health food stores do offer D2 though. I'm not sure why. Again, it's not as potent. There's not enough science behind its biological availability at present, so it's still a little bit of an unknown. So in the US, it's generally D3. Um, I probably haven't mentioned this yet in this class, but I do have to say that it's really important to remember the FDA doesn't actually regulate the amount or chemical concentration of what is in supplements. It's a little shocking. This is an interesting thing that we usually discuss in the in person class quite a bit. So yeah, the FDA, you can basically, if you're a vitamin or supplement company, you can put anything in those bottles. They don't legally have to say, like, they don't have to test that what you actually put in it is what you put in it. So is it vitamin D or is it something else? And they also don't have to legally test the amount that you put in it. So there was all this stuff about probably about 15 years ago where there was these ephedra supplements. People were using them for weight loss, and a lot of people had like heart attacks and died because they put in like so much of this supplement, which was kind of like an analog of ephedrine. Kind of boosted your metabolism a little bit to help people lose weight, but since it's not regulated by the FDA, they could just put in as much as they wanted, and then people were, yeah, kind of just dying from it. It was terrible. So the only thing now, even though it's an organization, it's not a government organization. It's called USP. It's an organization that just it is there to test basically what is put in supplements and how much. But it's really up to the company to decide whether or not they want to use them. So certain brands like Nature Made and Kirkland will use that company, but most companies don't. So, and if they do, there's usually like a little stamp on the front that says like USP tested or certified or something like that. But again, it's totally up to the company to decide whether or not they want that certification. So yeah, it's kind of crazy. Yeah, the FDA does not regulate supplements, vitamins, minerals, anything like that. So, looking at what does cooking do to vitamin D, it's a heat stable compound, so there's very little loss with cooking. So, this one you can kind of do pressure cooking, grilling, all that stuff, and nothing's going to happen to the actual vitamin D, the compound. It also doesn't really disappear or get degraded with food processing or long-term food storage. Um, so it's kind of like shelf stable, that type of thing. So yeah, generally a very like hearty vitamin. Absorption, nothing too special here. Follows all of the same pattern that we saw with the other fat soluble vitamins and basically the same absorption pathway as you would see for fat. So if you remember the two sources that we're getting from foods: D3, that's from animal products; D2, that's the one from irradiated mushrooms. Um, it's basically incorporated into the micelle just like everything else was. We have about a 50% absorption of vitamin D. Most people have that. And then it's incorporated into chylomicrons within the enterocyte, and then it's transported through the lymph into the circulation. And about 40% of the vitamin D travels to tissues in the chylomicron form, whereas the other 60% is transferred to the vitamin D binding protein for transport to tissues. So basically, 40% is distributed throughout the body by the chylomicron, and then another 60% is distributed by this binding protein. So leftover vitamin D, the stuff that, remember, chylomicrons they're kind of like a bus almost. You can kind of see it like that. They're just like traveling around the circulation, dropping stuff off here and there. But sometimes, passengers stay on the bus when it gets back to the bus station, I guess. You can kind of see it like that. So some of it will basically go back to the liver. And then at the liver, it undergoes further metabolism. So there's even more types of vitamin D to learn. I do have a summary slide, and I'll go over it a couple times because I know that pretty much most of this is new to you guys, and just to learn, yeah, what each thing does. So remember, we ended up with vitamin D3. That's from the diet. And then also remember, we got it from the sun. This is the form that kind of like seeped into the skin and entered the blood. So at this point, all the stuff from the sun and from the diet kind of come together at the tissue level or at the liver. And the D3 can't do its job in this form. So what the liver does is it basically puts a hydroxyl group on it by the action of the enzyme 25-hydroxylase in the liver. That adds this OH hydroxyl group. Then it becomes 25-OH-D3. And then another name for 25-OH-D3 is calcidiol. Other tissues are also able to do this conversion. Most of it does happen in the liver, but other tissues can kind of make it into this form. And this form is really important because this is actually, this is released into the blood, and this is the main storage form of vitamin D. So vitamin D, for the most part, is stored in the blood, and it kind of circulates around in this form, 25-OH-D3, waiting to be activated. And I'll show you on the next few slides what the activated form looks like. But when they measure your vitamin D status, they're actually measuring how much of this you have, the 25-OH-D3. So the amount, that's, it is the storage form, but it also happens to be in the blood. So that makes it really easy to assess what your vitamin D levels are, because the storage form happens to be in like an accessible, measurable form. So we can just do a blood test for vitamin D then. And then that also reflects how much you're getting from the diet and the sun. Remember, because the D3 came from both absorption of food, and then also this is the form that we got from the skin. Vitamin D2, they've noticed that it does undergo kind of the same pathway. So when you ingest it, it does go to the liver, it's hydroxylated, it becomes 25-OH-D2. But the functions of it aren't well understood. So whether or not it participates in all the functions I'm going to show you in the function slides still isn't clear. So at this point, we're just not going to discuss it anymore. I'd say for D2, no, it's like the plant source, the one that you get from mushrooms. It's available, but in general, if people find the D2 as a supplement, I would tell them, don't use the D2, use the D3, because the D3 is the one that we know that definitely does all those beneficial functions of vitamin D. So again, main storage site is the blood. So just to make that perfectly clear, it just turns out that once the liver and those tissues convert the vitamin D3 into 25-OH-D3, that it just releases it into the blood, and it basically just floats around there waiting to be activated. And they found that the half-life of D3 is about 3 weeks or so. So it circulates for a little while in the blood. So when you want to actually activate it and turn it into the form that can actually do functions in the body, this 25-OH-D3, the circulating kind of status storage form, has to go to the kidney and then be converted into 125-OH-2D3. So basically another hydroxyl group has been added, and this is done by a hydroxylase enzyme in the kidney. So it's basically, hydroxylated for a second time. When it becomes this form, it's called calcitriol, and this is the main active form of the vitamin. So 25-OH-D3, circulating storage form, the form that's floating around waiting to be activated. Once the body needs it, goes to the kidney, then it's converted to this, which is the main active form, calcitriol, or 125-OH-D3. The body can actually make it into a second active form as well. And this other active form is called 24-25-OH-D3. It doesn't have like a special name like calcitriol or anything. It's just referred to as the 24-25-OHD3 form. So yeah, two major forms. And then these two active forms, so the 125-OHD3 and the 24-25-OHD3, leave the kidney bound to that binding protein, vitamin D binding protein, and basically go on to do its functions. So here's the review slides. This I probably spend, again, if you're kind of don't have enough time to study for the exam, this is like one of the most important sets of slides, this one and the next few. So, and this kind of also summarizes all the different terms that we went over, because I know it is confusing. They all kind of sound the same. So remember, in the skin first, we started with 7-dehydrocholesterol. This is kind of like squirted out onto the surface of the, released onto the surface of the skin, I guess you could say. Then the sun touches this. Once the sun touches this, the ring structure opens. It becomes pre-vitamin D3. This hangs out on the surface of the skin for 2 days or so, 2 to 3 days, to undergo more of a conformational change to become vitamin D3. Then that D3, also called cholecalciferol, travels to, so that enters the blood, travels to the liver, and then becomes the storage form. So the calcidiol or 25-OHD3. And then this is also the form, remember, that we're just getting straight from our diet. So it's absorbed, and again, that just goes straight to the liver. Then, when our body needs vitamin D, first it has to put it into its active form. There's 2 active forms. In order to activate it, it needs to go to the kidney, because the kidney has that enzyme which adds on those 2 other hydroxyl groups to make it 125-OH2D3 or 24-25-OH2D3. And then the 125 form is called calcitriol, whereas the 24-25 doesn't have a specific other name. So again, which ones are the storage forms? So what's the one floating around in the blood? This guy, calcidiol. What's the one that's the active form that actually does the job of vitamin D? These two, 24-25 and calcitriol, are the 125 form. So we're going to go through not all of these functions. We'll do most of these next week, but we are going to talk about its main role in calcium homeostasis, and then also how vitamin D is related to obesity. So it's a little bit confusing because kind of all our lives we're told that vitamin D helps build bones, but if you remember from your physiology classes, probably a review for a lot of you, vitamin D actually breaks down your bones. So it's like, it helps with, so it's not, if I ask you on an exam, like, what is it doing? Please don't say that it helps build bones, because it doesn't do that directly. It actually, the main thing it does, and I'll show you all of this in a second, is it actually like takes calcium from your bones. So it actually initiates calcium resorption, which means bone breakdown. But yeah, let's just go through this step by step, and I can discuss that a bit more afterwards. So how is calcium homeostasis all mediated in the body? The initiating step of this process is obviously a decrease in circulating calcium. So our calcium levels are actually held in a pretty tight range. I forget what it is. I think it's like 9 through 11. I had low calcium when I was first diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's very tightly controlled. So when the body senses just even a slight decrease in circulating calcium levels, it immediately, the parathyroid gland is signaled, and then that basically, the low calcium signals the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone, PTH. And then the PTH is what actually tells the kidney to increase the synthesis, or just to, get those 2 active forms of vitamin D kind of moving, like getting those produced. So again, parathyroid hormone reacts to the low calcium levels. What it does is it releases parathyroid hormone, PTH. Parathyroid hormone travels to the kidney and tells the kidney to increase the synthesis of the two active forms of vitamin D. So remember, that's the 125 and the 2425 form. And then the next step of that is calcitriol. Then, even though it was just made by the kidney, it kind of acts back on the kidney and tells the kidney to start reabsorbing more calcium. So in general, remember, the kidney is just filtering your blood, and unless it's specifically told, or if there's something that's made into metabolite, there has to be some type of signal to the kidney to tell it to reabsorb something. And so for calcium, it's calcitriol, so the active form of vitamin D, has to tell the kidney, okay, don't let all this calcium just pass into the urine, make sure you reabsorb it. So that's one step of getting, like, kind of increasing calcium levels in the blood. So less is released into the urine and more is just kept in the blood and in the body by the kidney. The second one is more absorption via the intestine. So that activated form of vitamin D, the 125, so calcitriol, then travels from the kidney, because remember it was activated there, travels to the intestine, and then that basically results in more calcium absorption. And I'll show you the exact mechanism for that in a second. And then at the level of the bone, a bunch of different factors act on the bone. So parathyroid hormone itself, and then both active forms of vitamin D, so the 125 and the 124 form, act on the bone, and it stimulates bone breakdown. So bone breakdown, another kind of fancy word for that, remember, is bone resorption. So don't confuse that with reabsorption, which means, reabsorbing something from the intestine or whatever, reabsorbing it from the kidney. Resorption means bone breakdown or breakdown. So to summarize, vitamin D basically helps increase calcium levels in the blood by acting on 3 different tissues. One is the kidney, tells it to reabsorb more calcium from the blood, so don't let that calcium enter the urine and excrete it, reabsorb it. It goes to the intestine, and it tells the intestine to absorb more calcium from the diet. And then it also goes to the bone, and it basically causes the bone to give up more calcium. And then that way, all these things are basically just causing this influx of calcium into the blood. And then that increases blood calcium. So let's look more specifically what it's doing at the level of the intestine. Calcitriol is actually acting as a hormone to mediate these effects. So when I'm saying, let's just look at specifically what it's doing. So calcitriol, like, how exactly is it increasing calcium absorption? And this kind of plays into what you'll learn in the calcium slides as well. So calcitriol enters the intestinal cell, the enterocyte. It binds to the vitamin D receptor, so this is how it's acting as a hormone. That calcitriol VDR complex travels to the nucleus, and then that interacts with genes encoding calcium transport, and then basically DNA transcription occurs that results in the biosynthesis of new mRNA. And then as a result, more of this compound or this receptor, calbindin, is made. It's basically a calcium binding protein in the enterocyte. So very simply what's happening, even though it's kind of a complicated way of saying it, the 125 OHD3 form, calcitriol, is entering the enterocyte, telling the enterocyte at the nuclear level to start making more calbindin, which is a binding protein for calcium. The calbindin, once it's made, travels to the brush border, and then the more calbindin that's on there, that results in increased calcium absorption. So it's basically telling the vitamin D as a hormone is telling the enterocyte, make more of these receptors, more of them float to the surface of the enterocyte, and then that way there's basically more doors or more ways that calcium can then enter the enterocyte and then eventually the body. And then, so how is vitamin D in the 24, 25, and the 125 form, how is that actually breaking down or mobilizing bone? So how does it do this? Well, if you remember from your physiology classes, osteoclasts are the cells that break down bone. So vitamin D actually stimulates the maturation of osteoclasts, those cells that break down bone. So here they are, osteoclast precursors, kind of like the babies. They, by the action of vitamin D, so the two active forms, these cells mature, and this is what they actually kind of look like. Kind of like monsters or something, or octopuses or something like that. So these are the mature form of the osteoclasts. And then what they actually do, it's pretty interesting. They actually kind of grab onto the bone and then secrete HCl and collagenases and basically cause the bone to melt. So when these cells break down bone, they kind of like latch on to it and literally just melt the bone. And then when you melt the bone, you're basically releasing calcium into the blood because obviously bones store a very large amount of calcium. And if you're kind of degrading the bone, then that calcium will basically get released and then enter the blood. So that's what vitamin D is doing at the level of the bone. So remember, vitamin D, it is a little confusing because, we're told that take vitamin D supplements and calcium supplements to build up your bone. And I think the confusing thing is that the overall effect is, we're trying to have calcium increase in the blood. And then I'm sure that calcium will get put back into the bone eventually. But, if you have low enough levels, the calcium, might just have to go to other areas because calcium is used for a whole bunch of different things, nerve conduction, muscle contraction, a whole bunch of different things. So, if it's needed more there, then maybe it won't go back to the bone. So it is confusing. Taking calcium and vitamin D supplements does work to build back up bone eventually if you're getting enough. So I think, again, the net effect of all this is that you can build bone with calcium and vitamin D. But the confusing thing is the exact function of vitamin D is to actually break down bone. I don't know if I would actually tell this to any of your clients unless they're like really into this, because I think it would just confuse them. But just so you know for yourselves, vitamin D is actually like causing bones to melt almost. So now let's look at the function or the role of vitamin D in obesity. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard that there's this relationship where people that have higher BMIs tend to have lower levels of vitamin D status. And I used to teach advanced vitamins and minerals. I haven't taught it in a while, but one of the things that we really worked on was trying, because there was just so much research coming out about vitamin D, we really wanted to look at, well, first of all, what is like what is an appropriate like blood status or blood level of vitamin D? And right now, it kind of varies, but for the most part, most hospitals will say it's between 30 to 70. I believe that's, can't remember, per deciliter or something, but 30 to 70 is the general range. And they usually measure it if you go to like annuals and stuff like that, and a lot of people fall below that 30. Myself, and I feel like I have a very healthy diet and get a lot of like sun exposure, is like only like a 35 or a 40 or something. So it's hard to get in that upper range. So a lot of people are considered to have like kind of suboptimal or low vitamin D status. But then another thing we looked at in that course is like, how is that figured out? How do we even know that that's the optimal range? And, there's a lot of different papers saying that maybe even like 20 is an acceptable range. Like that should be the minimum instead of the 30. So it's not super clear. Like you'd think that all this stuff is like set in stone, but if you look at the research and like how these things are decided, you'll see that it's actually like still, for vitamin D, it's still pretty up in the air. So anyway, what they've noticed in a lot of studies, and this is in all different countries of the world, so basically across the globe, all different continents, they realize that as someone's BMI goes up, so people with a BMI over 30, 40, 50, etc., that those people tend to have much lower levels of vitamin D. So their vitamin D status is usually like in the tens and the teens, that type of thing. And again, yeah, if you just look through this, these are mainly like cross-sectional analyses where they just like measure everybody's vitamin D status, measure their BMI, and then just run a correlation. So I'm not saying, remember, the main thing you can learn from taking science undergrads or masters is that correlation does not equal causation. So just because something's related doesn't mean that anything, is it the vitamin D that's like causing the obesity, or is it the obesity that's causing the vitamin D deficiency? Who knows? This is just a basic cross-sectional analysis to say that these two things are related. So it, again, just to kind of say, remember the main storage form, or the thing that we're actually measuring the blood, is the 25-OHD3 form, and that is low amounts. So again, in the tens and teens, that's very prevalent in individuals with obesity. And they have found in most parts of the world that vitamin D status is inversely correlated to BMI, and then also visceral fat, so that part that's your abdominal fat tissue. And then they have found that the associations are stronger in certain ethnic groups, such as African Americans and Hispanic Latino individuals. And they're found across the board, so in children, adolescents, and adults. One thing that, we'll talk about this more in the next lecture, but one thing that can contribute in African American and Hispanic individuals is actually melanin production. So as a person has darker skin tones, that darker skin tone is basically, I think it's actually melanin that is what's coloring your skin. I can't remember. I know it's correlated with it, but I think it's actually a pigment in the skin. So as someone has darker skin tones, they have more melanin in the skin. And melanin is great in the sense that it acts as a natural sunblock. So people with darker skin tones tend to have much less risk of skin cancer just because they have this natural sunblock in their skin. And so melanin is there, and it really kind of just deflects UV light. So again, great for preventing skin cancer, but it's not great for helping your body kind of increase vitamin D levels because it's not allowing the sun to interact with that 7-dehydrocholesterol. And so that whole process of making 7-dehydrocholesterol into vitamin D3 then kind of doesn't occur as much, just again because the UV light can't perform that kind of interaction with it. So that might be one reason. It's literally just the sheer amount of melanin in someone's skin that may result in why they have lower levels of vitamin D. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that are related to it as well. Access to healthy foods can be a problem, of course. Access to just being able to be outside, so feeling safe and being able to exercise outside and get enough sun exposure. There's a lot of different things that play into it in the US. And so that's what results in basically lower vitamin D status by BMI category. And then there's also basically people with darker color skin also tend to have lower vitamin D status as well. So we still don't know if it's a causal or a correlation. How are these things related? There are, basically, I've mentioned a couple different things, but there's also genetic mechanisms that can underlie this association. So it has been shown that in certain groups of people that vitamin D can be sequestered in adipose tissue. So that means that certain people, and from my understanding, this is not related to race. I've seen this in all different people, all different races and ethnicities. But basically, in certain groups of people, I guess families or whatever, vitamin D can be sequestered, which means that the adipose tissue just hangs on to vitamin D and doesn't let it go. So it just kind of like grabs it, stores it, even though vitamin D should not be stored in the adipose tissue, it just kind of stays in there and it reduces bioavailability. So vitamin D is then not able to kind of get activated by the kidney and go on and do its functions. So that's one thing that happens in certain individuals. And then there's also problems. They've noticed that people, if you have genetic susceptibility to become obese, then that's also related to problems with vitamin D metabolism. Specifically, they've noted two things. Mainly that the kidney can't, or one main thing, I guess you should say, the kidney has problems activating vitamin D. So, in certain people, as BMI goes up, and this is probably some type of genetic thing, that they just can't, as their body size goes up, their ability to activate vitamin D goes down. And then other possible lifestyle factors that could contribute to this is people with obesity may be more sedentary. Of course, this isn't always the case, but potentially they may participate in fewer outdoor activities. And then this would also result, obviously, in less sun exposure and then reduce vitamin D production. But there have also been studies showing that vitamin D status in obesity is not related to sun exposure. So some studies show that, some don't. So it's not, this whole area is not very well understood. Obviously, there's tons of variables that are related to obesity. I sometimes teach a graduate course on obesity, and this is something that we discuss in depth. So if you're interested in that, Vanessa Odo is currently teaching that. But yeah, it's definitely something that, needs a bit more exploration. So I'm not going to go through these this time. I'll save it for the next lecture in vitamin D. Please feel free, though. I think one thing that might help you just to jog your own memory without me going through it, because I know at this point there's a lot. Maybe just fill these in on your own. It will help jog your memory since the exam is coming up next week, I believe. So, yeah, have fun filling in this table if it helps you. If not, don't bother, or maybe make your own table. That's definitely a way that people like to study for the exams. And please tune in on Fridays. Any questions you have, anything at all, questions, comments, I'd love to hear from you guys on Friday during our live Q&A session. Okay, great. Well, have a great rest of your day.